Welcome to this episode of Flourishing Leadership. I'm your host, Guy Rogers, and our mission here is to help you unleash the full potential of your leadership calling. You can find out more about Flourishing Leadership at flourishing-leadership.com. My guest today is Dr. Everett Piper. Dr. Piper is the author of the best-selling book, Not a Daycare: The Devastating Consequences of Abandoning Truth. Piper served as president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University for 17 years, during which time he led his school from relative obscurity to a position of national recognition and influence. It was while he was president of Oklahoma Wesleyan that we met back in 2014. I came to quickly realize that he was a bright light for truth, clarity, and courage within our culture's rapid descent into chaos. Small wonder that Dr. Piper is a contributing columnist for the Washington Times, and he's been a guest on a wide variety of television shows, from The O'Reilly Factor to Tucker Carlson Tonight to The Huckabee Show. He's provided guest commentary for dozens of talk radio programs and has guest hosted several, such as Michael Medved's and Mike Gallagher's programs. In 2016, he was awarded the Jeane Kirkpatrick Award for Academic Freedom. His viral op-ed, This Is Not a Daycare, It's a University, which became his second book, was featured by NBC Today as one of its top 10 news stories of 2015. Dr. Piper is a man I greatly respect and admire, and who I count it an honor to call colleague and friend. And you can find out more about him and his perspectives by visiting Dr. Everett Piper, and that's dreverettpiper.com. Everett, thank you so much for taking the time to join the podcast today.
Well, thanks, Guy. Honored to join your show. It's good to see you again.
It is. It's always good to reconnect. And one of the things I've had in these podcasts is opportunities to reconnect with old friends. Recently had Mike Huckabee on the program, and just that opportunity to catch up and see what people are doing and hear their perspectives now in terms of where Christianity and culture and leadership is today compared to as recently as when we met in 2014. Things have changed a lot rapidly, haven't they?
Oh, it's the cultural collapse that we're seeing right now. And whether you're a secularist or a Christian, wherever you are in the political scheme, you've got to admit that our culture, the glue that holds us together as a society, those common rows, if you will, those cultivated rows. I don't know if people understand that the etymology of the word culture includes the word cult. And that's not a reference to a false religion. It's a reference to a worldview, the common rows of cultivating a field in a consistent manner rather than chaos. And when you don't have the commonality of shared values, those rows of culture, if you will, you don't have that common glue that holds us together, and we collapse. And surely we're seeing that right now when you've got 50% of the American people that say X and 50% of the American people say Y, and never the twain shall meet. And rather than a united states, we're a divided state. So yes, the collapse is real. All of us are watching it, and it's of great concern.
Yeah, when we get to a point where we have a large segment of society not being able to define what a man and a woman is, and ignoring total obvious scientific biological facts, that speaks volumes about where we are.
It really does. And the irony, and you know where I'm going to go with this probably before I even open my mouth, the irony of the fact that you just described, that a major percentage of our population does not accept the biological fact of a female any longer, that a woman isn't real. The definition of a female is a fabrication rather than an epistemological and ontological fact, that you can make it up. And if you, as a man, declare yourself to be a woman, that makes it so. The fact that those people who buy into that worldview accuse us, conservatives, of being science deniers, the irony there is so rich.
It is.
I mean, we're denying the most obvious science before our very eyes. In fact, the first person that saw you upon birth, probably before your mother even laid eyes on you, was a doctor. And he pronounced a scientific fact at the point of birth. It's a boy or it's a girl. He turned to your mother and or your father and said, this is a boy or this is a girl. That was a fact declared by a scientist. And now we have a culture that is so much in disarray, so confused, that we're now belittling and maligning those people who just want to say, can't we just agree on that reality that women are real? They're not fabrications. They're not fantasies. They're not make-believe. They're not leprechauns and unicorns. Females are actually facts, and you can't be a feminist if you deny the feminine. And if we want to stand for women's rights, we've got to admit that they have no rights if we deny their reality. Saying what I just said makes me a science denier. You just have to scratch your head, don't you?
Well, you do, and so that begs my first question to you, and that is in the context of leadership as a Christian, in where the culture is, how do we lead well, knowing that what you're saying is precisely the reality that we're dealing with?
You know, there are so many ways you could answer that question, and the first thing that comes to mind when you ask me that is, and it's a worn out cliche, but it's something I think as Christians we need to continue to go back to, and that is the "what would Jesus do" response. And I think there's a Jesus style of apologetics, of engaging in a debate, engaging in argumentation, conversation. When Jesus was asked controversial questions, the smartest guy that ever walked the face of the earth, at least I would argue that. I mean, he is the second person of the triune God. Jesus's divinity would presuppose that he probably could have won most of the arguments that he engaged in. He probably knew the answer.
Yep.
But rather than arguing with his adversaries, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, or the politicians of his time, the Romans, rather than arguing with them, he almost always responded with a simple rhetorical question. For example, whose face is on the coin? Why do you call me Lord? Do you want to pick up the stone and throw it? And then God himself, the Word made flesh and dwelling among us, the creator of everything, decides not to argue. He shuts his mouth and he just remains quiet.
He waits.
While the worldview of his opponents collapses.
Right.
And they drop stones and walk away. Maybe we would do well as we engage culture as leaders to revisit the beauty of the rhetorical question, the well-placed question that exposes the reality of the debate. For example, what's one of the highest virtues of the progressive left today? Well, it's tolerance. Well, I often respond to those who are arguing for tolerance by asking the question, can you tolerate my intolerance? And then just be quiet. Or you argue that love trumps hate. Well, do you hate hateful people? You say that you're sure that nothing is sure. Really? You are sure that nothing is sure. You say that you know nothing can be known. Do you think that maybe that's a self-refuting position because you're claiming to know something that you yourself claim is unknowable? You say you're absolutely confident there are no absolutes. Do you recognize that really we're watching a dog chase its tail right now? Mm-hmm. You're sawing away upon the branch upon which you sit. You're sawing away at the branch upon which you sit, and it's going to collapse. So simple questions like, can you tolerate my intolerance? Are you sure that nothing is sure? Do you know that nothing can be known? Are you absolutely confident there are no absolutes? And really, do you really hate those hateful people? Those questions expose the duplicity and the self-refuting nature of the progressive worldview. And I've found that when you ask those questions, their heads explode. They don't know what to say. And this was a real issue within the academy, within the ivory tower, where I made my profession. You had very smart people that carry those terminal degrees, PhD diplomas on their walls that were uttering this nonsense. And I didn't have to debate them. I would just ask the question and then just watch, because they couldn't answer unless they wanted to be honest and say, I think you have a legitimate point. Let's discuss the issue by first acknowledging that my position is probably as intolerant as the one I'm claiming you hold. That rarely happens. But
it does rarely happen. But I will share a quick story to what you exactly just said. So when I was a public high school teacher 40 years ago, and this was, of course, well early compared to where we are today, but I had a number of secularists in my department, social studies, one in particular who was very irreverent and would challenge me all the time. And so we ended up in a conversation after school one day for about 90 minutes on that very issue about absolutes. And he challenged me, said, Guy, there are no absolutes. So I began a series of questions. I was then reading Francis Schaeffer at the time and pushed them to the logical conclusion of their assumptions approach. And at the end of 90 minutes, by my asking questions, he was very exasperated. And he said, Guy, Here's what I can tell you. One thing I'm sure of, and that you can't be certain of anything. And I paused and looked at him just like you're looking at me now. And I just said simply, are you sure of that? Yeah. And he stomped away mad. But the end of the story is there was another man in that department who was very bitter and angry against God, and 8 months later got saved. And when I asked him were there any catalysts to that, he said, well, you remember that conversation you had with that teacher and how it ended up? He said, I heard him say that, and I thought to myself, that is absurd. And I opened my Bible for the first time in 25 years.
Yeah.
So there are times we can have an audience for something like this and do exactly what you are saying. Lead by asking questions, not by trying to argue.
Yes. Spot on. And that example, that anecdote that you just shared could be multiplied thousands of times over. And I think one thing that I would suggest in your anecdote is when we're engaged in this debate, if you will, well, let me back up. I often have people ask me, why do you do this? Why do you engage in social media like you do? Why do you have these debates with people that disagree with you? You're not going to win them over. Don't you know that? And my response is, that may be true. I'm not entering into the cultural conversation assuming that I'm going to win over the progressive or the leftist. But I also recognize other people are watching.
Correct.
So even though I may not win over the person that's in direct debate with me, I know there's an audience, especially in social media today. That audience may be 5,000, 10,000. I don't know how many people are engaged in that thread of communication. But what I do know, others are watching and they're taking notice. And when you ask these good questions like you asked, are you sure that nothing is sure? People are watching and they recognize the absurdity of your opponent's worldview, that it's self-refuting. It doesn't hold water. And so I think we should be encouraged that even though we may, quote unquote, lose the debate with the immediate person engaged with us, that we likely are winning it with 1, 2, 10, 1,000 others that are watching because they recognize that your question made a lot more sense than your opponent's position. And just rest in that. Rest in that, recognizing that truth has power. And a question that points to objective truth has great power to expose the lie. Another example that I think today is the progressives are big about justice. They want to discuss justice. This is another one of their primary virtues. Can you have justice without a judge? Who's deciding what's just? Can you engage in the pursuit of justice if you don't acknowledge that something bigger than you or me has to be the measuring rod of that standard of justice? You can't have justice, I would argue, without a judge. And if they want to argue differently, I would be quiet and I would just ask them to explain. All right, if you believe justice can be had without a judge, who's deciding? And ultimately, they're going to put themselves in the position of that judge.
Of course, they're the judge, right?
There's no other way to get there.
Right.
And I would rather you not be my judge. I would rather have something bigger and better than you to be the ultimate judge of justice at the end of the day. You can't have justice without a judge and a jury, period. It just can't be had, because otherwise it all digresses and diminishes. It all implodes upon itself to what David Horowitz called the rule of the gang, where the gang prevails, right, and squashes all opposition. And we're getting very close to having that as our ultimate reality right now in Western culture.
Oh, we are. The founding fathers talked about this when they referred to terms like mobocracy, things of that nature. It is the rule of the gang, the rule of the mob. So thinking about what we've just been talking about, it seems to me that there is a lack of Christian leaders who are engaging in this type of approach, this type of leadership, the Jesus leadership, asking the rhetorical questions. First of all, would you agree with that? And second of all, if that's the case, why is that happening? How do we change that?
Yes, I do agree with you. One of the most frustrating things that I experienced while I was in Christian education was the lack of spine and conviction in Christian educators. Why? I could sit around and give you several different reasons as to why I think they lacked biblical conviction and orthodoxy. I think part of it is they had a lousy education themselves. They weren't taught to think, even though they had risen to the pinnacle of the ivory tower. They really didn't know how to engage in a good debate. A lot of Christian colleges don't even teach logic or rhetoric any longer. Most Christian colleges that I'm aware of have nothing to offer in terms of apologetics. There are a couple that do, but I'm a product of Christian education, both at the high school level and at the undergraduate level. And I was never exposed to anything with regard to apologetics in that entire time. And this was back in the 70s and 80s.
Wow.
And it's a lot worse now. Why? I don't know for sure, but it's a fact that there's a lack of solid education when it comes to logic, rhetoric, and even the basics of defending a biblical worldview through solid apologetics. In fact, even at the Oklahoma Wesleyan University, when I became president, I kept talking about the fact that we were going to launch the Josh McDowell Institute for Christian Apologetics. I had a board member, a good guy, a conservative guy, a strong supporter of mine, pull me aside privately and say, I don't like the fact that you keep using that word, apologetics. It sounds like you're telling us that we need to apologize for our Christianity.
Apologize, right.
So he didn't even understand. And he's a board member of a conservative Christian institution, and he doesn't understand the importance of apologetics. He wants me to stop saying it. I think one of the reasons, additional reason that the Christian Academy is lost is its desire for popularity. We're the poor stepchild, if you will, within the ivory tower. Most of the academics in the Christian schools have at least a subconscious desire to rise to the same status of Harvard, Dartmouth, Princeton, and Yale, or perhaps Oklahoma State University or Ohio, the University of Ohio or the University of Kansas, or OSU or MSU or whatever other state university of prominence you have in your backyard. We don't like the fact that they kind of look down their nose at us. And therefore, we react and we start trying to play their game. And we dumb down our identity, our Christian convictions for the sake of secular popularity so that we can be invited to the colloquiums, so that we can present papers that are published. And C.S. Lewis actually talks about this in The Great Divorce, where he challenges the young scholar and says, we never really wrote essays for the sake of truth. And I'm paraphrasing right now. We wrote our essays. We took our tests. We engaged in the academic discussion for the sake of popularity. We just went along with the flow. We jumped into the current of what was successful and popular. We never challenged the status. C.S. Lewis says that in The Great Divorce. So this was taking place in his day, and it certainly is taking place in ours. We ignore the power of truth for the sake of the popular, and the popular is almost always grounded in opinions rather than the objectivity of truth.
So listeners to this podcast come from all walks of life. They're business leaders, they're educators, there are entrepreneurs. And I suspect the reason they're listening to this is they want to grow in their leadership. I do leadership coaching. The reason I have clients is because that's what they want. They want to grow in their servant leadership. I believe this ability to speak into the culture, to do as Jesus did, to ask questions, is really a paramount ability right now that we need to equip other Christian leaders with so that they'll feel more courage. When you know to ask questions and then you allow it to happen, you can really feel more courageous about a conversation because you're not trying to argue anymore. You're just asking good questions.
Yeah. Here's and actually, for me, it takes a burden off of my shoulders to think that I need to know everything. Because frankly, you've got areas of expertise that are superior to mine. And everybody listening to this podcast right now, if you're a CPA, you know more about accounting than I do. If you're a medical doctor, you know more about biology and physiology and genetics than I do. If you're a physicist, obviously, you know a lot more about physics than I do. So I don't want to feel the pressure all the time to know everything you know about your profession. And I can't even engage in a conversation or challenge your ideas if I don't. And by recognizing the power of a well-placed question, it takes the burden off of me to think I need to go read up on physics before I ever engage in asking a physicist a simple question about, well, if there's design, doesn't there have to be a designer?
Right.
If there's order, doesn't there have to be an orderer? When I drive through a subdivision, I assume that there was an architect, an engineer, and a builder. And isn't that logical for me to do so? When I open a book, I assume that there was a writer and a publisher. When I look at a painting, I assume there was an artist and a painter. So as I look at order and reason and rationality and beauty and logic and all of these other venues of life, Mr. Physicist, why shouldn't I apply the same to the issue of the human being and the creation that we see around us? Because obviously, it sure seems like there's an author behind this book, that there's an inventor behind this invention.
Sure.
But you're arguing as a secularist that it all just kind of happened, that all this stuff got put in a paper bag and it was shaken up for several million years. When we opened up the bag, voila, we had the human being. That seems peculiar to me. Can you explain it to me? Now, nothing that I just said in the last 2 minutes demonstrated any great knowledge on my part of physics or biology or genetics. Everything I just said was just good common sense. And I would argue that that common sense needs to be addressed by the expert in whatever field.
So we're equipping our listeners today with some ideas, examples, and approaches to how to better lead in the culture by practicing this art of asking good questions. I was fortunate. I had a president of a Bible school who discipled me 4 decades ago for 4 years. And it was through that process that I was exploring Schaeffer and C.S. Lewis and people like that challenged me to think differently and to then ask questions. But I suspect that our typical listener doesn't have that kind of opportunity. That kind of discipleship is not common, unfortunately, in our churches. So what would you say to the listener in terms of how that person, if they desire this, could be better equipped to do exactly what we're talking about here in the cultural milieu we're in today?
Oh, there are some great resources that we can avail ourselves of right now. The first thing that comes to mind is the Colson Institute's Fellows Program. That's a program where you can enroll, and throughout the course of a year, some of it's online, some of it's on ground, you are exposed to solid apologetics. And it's specifically designed not for the pastor, but for the lay leader. So if you're a lay leader out there and you want to know more about Schaeffer and C.S. Lewis, if you want to know more about Colson and Nancy Percy, if you want to know more about arguments for creation and design as opposed to radical Darwinism, if you want to know more about how to confront the subjective nature of LGBTQIA and the fact that we're dumbing down the definition of the human being to nothing but the sum total of our inclinations, that's our identity. If you want to know more about any and all of this stuff, if you want to know more about the historicity of the Bible and its accuracy over time, then you can learn that at the Colson Institute. And I strongly advise anybody to look into that. Just Google Colson Institute and look for their Fellows Program. There's one near you in your regional area. Another one that is kind of the Colson Institute on steroids is the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. It's over in England at the University of Oxford. It's housed through Wycliffe College, and it's an excellent program where you are exposed to some of the best Christian thinkers of our time. People such as John Lennox or Michael Ramsden or Abdu Murray, who converted out of Islam into Christianity. These are Christian thinkers that are on the front lines of explaining and defending the faith around the world. I was a member of both of these programs. I'm a graduate of the Colson program, and I also spent 5 weeks over in Oxford studying at the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. Now, another one for your kids, look into Worldview Academy. Worldview Academy is a 1-week boot camp for 14 to 17-year-old kids. And it's a boot camp on ground at they usually rent a local university campus to do this camp for your kids. And they spend an entire week being exposed to a biblical worldview, guest speakers and readings and whatnot. Both of my sons went through that. And then another one for slightly older kids, and I would say seniors in high school, maybe freshmen in college, is Summit Ministries out in the foothills near Colorado Springs. And that's a 2-week program where they're exposed to Christian apologetics and how to think critically and how to defend a biblical worldview. There are tons of ways to get this. And then finally, if you don't have time to do any of that and you're a business leader, then invite you, Guy, to come and be a guest speaker. I'd be honored to come and do a weekend seminar. There are thousands of ways that you can be exposed to this stuff And there's no excuse, quite frankly, for not doing so if you want to be well equipped to engage in the cultural debate.
Well, Everett, I'm familiar with all of those. I know during my tenure as president at Pinnacle Forum, we had a number of our Pinnacle Forum partners who went through the Colson Institute. But your last point is well taken. It may be a businessman or a businesswoman hears this, or someone they go, I don't have the time for this. I can't fit this into my schedule. And so thank you for the plug, because yes, I would be happy. I would be delighted to spend a Saturday with some business leaders and just walk, with them. I did this with some high school students at my church in Pensacola, Florida. These were, freshmen, sophomores, and just taking them through this in an informal way, to the point where one of them said, I have an atheist friend of mine at school. Could I invite him? And I said, absolutely. I ended up having a number of conversations with him. The smartest young person scary smart person, a devotee of Ayn Rand, objectivism. And we would talk through some of those things. And when I moved from Pensacola to Arizona, he sent me a text and he said, Guy, I just want you to know your words have not been lost on me. Mm. And since then, he has sent me texts like, I'm reading, get this, Dostoevsky. I'm reading, and he's giving me some of the people he's reading. He says, I wouldn't object to being called a Christian today, though I'm not sure I believe the whole Bible. But I'm looking at this, I'm going, how far he came from where he was because of a discussion about these kinds of things. So yes, Everett, I know you'd be happy to do this. If you're a listener, I'd be happy to do this. We can equip you. And it's really not as complicated as it sounds. That's the beauty of it. I like your point. You don't have to be an expert in the field of the person you're talking to.
Yeah. And just to further the plug, and you and I didn't even talk about this in advance. So
no, we didn't.
I don't want your listeners to think this was all planned, because it's not. But it's still a good point, whether it's planned or not. If they wanted you and me to come in and tag team for a weekend because they don't want to listen to one person ad nauseum for 5, 6, 7 hours. Hey, if you don't want Guy and Everett, that's fine. But this is something that we do and we're passionate about it. And if you want somebody else in your general area, you probably call us up and we could recommend somebody else. But this is fun stuff. And if you've made your living off of doing it, you should be, as you have and as I have, you should be open to trying to help people on an individual basis. And it's easy to do. So to the folks that are listening to your podcast, give us a buzz if you want some help, and we'll offer it.
And interesting, you and I have our backgrounds, our paths are different. Mm-hmm. You were in the educational world. I was in the political and entrepreneurial world. But yet, we've come to this place where we recognize how valuable this is and how important it is. And I'm with you. It's why I do leadership coaching. I just want to help empower people to be the kind of Christian leaders they in their heart want to be. And this is critical in our time. More and more leaders in the marketplace, especially, who can ask these kinds of questions and who can do it in a loving way, but in a challenging way, and put the onus on the person who's making their own case and saying, wait a minute, I love the one about tolerance. Yeah. Wait a minute. So can you have tolerance of what you call my intolerance? Tell me how that works.
Exactly. And then, as I said earlier, that's all you need to say, because they have to respond to your question. And the response is going to be difficult because you just exposed the fact that their worldview is self-refuting. Like I said earlier, it's like a dog chasing its tail. You can just step back and smile as the dog circles trying to catch that thing that's uncatchable.
Right.
And then once they admit that, you can really have a robust conversation about why I've trusted in a measuring rod outside of myself. To quote C.S. Lewis, you can do no measuring unless there's a measuring rod outside of those things being measured. I don't declare myself to be the ultimate measurement, the ultimate standard of anything. That's why the subtitle to my book, Not a Daycare, is The Devastating Consequences of Abandoning Truth. Mm-hmm. You have to admit that there's a measuring rod outside of those things being measured, or you're going to stop doing measuring by any standard other than the rule of the gang, the mob, mass rule. And that never works very long, because the chaos created by the rule of the gang always is corrected by a tyrant, by a despot, who steps into the mess and says, I'll make sense out of this. I'll control everything. I'll make you all feel safe. One of the things that drives me crazy today is the elevation of safety over freedom. If one more person during the COVID nonsense would have said to me, be safe, I was going to strangle them. I don't want to be safe. I want to be free. Okay.
Yeah.
In fact, the subtitle to my second book, which is Grow Up, Life Isn't Safe, But It's Good, that's taken from C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia.
Correct.
The children are wondering if the great lion Aslan is safe. And the talking animals, Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, in that particular story, respond to the children and say, of course Aslan isn't safe. The great lion's safe? No, he's not safe, but he's good.
But he's good.
There's a huge difference between goodness and safety, and I'd much rather have the first rather than the second. And goodness is synonymous with freedom, in my view, that freedom lends itself to goodness, and goodness lends itself to freedom. But safety is something that our despots, are the smarter than thous, the elites among us, can use to our disadvantage, because they'll squash us to keep us safe, but we won't have freedom any longer. I despise this worship at the altar of safety that our culture has fallen into as the result of COVID.
Yeah, it's very frightening, actually, to watch and very disconcerting. So in the last few minutes we have together, I want to explore a question and get your take on this. There is a thread throughout Christianity. I'll describe it this way, and that is we should only focus on the simple gospel. And that is we lead people to Christ and we get them in church and we get them involved in our church ministries and so on. But as far as being transformative or agents of change or influencer in the culture, that is not our calling as Christians. I've run into it a lot, all the time, especially working in the political world. I know you have as well. For our listeners, I would like your take on how you see this and what you see is a problem with that approach.
I'll answer your question by sharing this little anecdote, this story of how I had to deal with it when I was the president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University. Oklahoma Wesleyan was becoming more and more successful. When I inherited it was in bankruptcy, and by God's grace, we were doing very well. The numbers were going in the right direction. We were receiving some national recognition, as you said in your introduction. Fox and Friends, Fox News, O'Reilly, Beck, Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, they were paying attention to us. Well, in the midst of this wave of success, my board started accusing me of being too political. Now, keep in mind, when I went on every show, I talked about the primacy of Christ, the priority of Scripture, the pursuit of truth, and the practice of wisdom, the four cornerstones of Oklahoma Wesleyan University. I shared that with Dave Rubin. I shared that with Adam Carolla. I was talking about Christ, Scripture, truth, wisdom with secularists and atheists like Carolla and Rubin. But yet my board was saying you're getting too political. And I was frustrated. I think, what are you talking about? Because the fourth pillar of our mission statement, primacy of Christ, priority of Scripture, pursuit of truth, and practice of wisdom, calls for orthopraxy as well as orthodoxy, that you practice what you preach. So one day in front of my board, I said, I know a few of you, it's a minority, a few of you think I'm getting too political because I'm talking about abortion or marriage or other social issues. And I looked at them and I said, who decided that the definition of human life was political rather than biblical? Who decided that the definition of marriage was political rather than biblical? Who decided that the definition of freedom and how we should live in freedom before God rather than being subjected to more and more largesse of government? Who decided that that was political rather than biblical? I said, it's interesting because the very foundation of your church, the Wesleyan Church, is grounded in the most politically contentious issue, arguably, in the history of the United States, and that's the Civil War.
Right.
It was Orange Scott, a man with a very unusual name, Orange Scott, and Luther Lee, who rose up out of the Methodist Church during the Civil War and said, wait a second, we've got our orthodoxy right, but we're not practicing what we preach. Our orthopraxy is off. We need to stand for human dignity, that a black man should not be enslaved. And therefore, the Wesleyan Church was launched out of the argument for freedom. And I said further to them, William Wilberforce argued for over 20 years on the floor of the British Parliament for what? The dignity of a human being, that black people should not be sold as chattel. Was William Wilberforce too political, or was he behaving biblically? Who decided that the definition of a black man as being human versus animal was political? Now, again, this was a series. My questions were intentional. They were serious. It was a series of rhetorical questions.
Mm-hmm.
Who decided? Who decided? Who decided? Life, marriage, human dignity, human freedom, the definition of what it means to be a human being. Who decided? Now, obviously, listening to me right now, I hope people get the point. I do not accept this. Well, let's just talk about the biblical nature of the gospel and let all of these other social issues work themselves out. No. That's not what William Wilberforce did. And had he done so, arguably there would have been a slave trade for decades hence. And it's certainly not what Orange Scott and Luther Lee did when they launched the Wesleyan Church and the Nazarene Church movement by arguing for freedom versus slavery. And I am not going to shut my mouth when I see people killing children for the sake of convenience at Planned Parenthood. And when the government presupposes to be the definition or the definer of marriage as opposed to God, I think Christians are obligated to say, wait a second, nobody gave you the right to become judge and jury over what God has already defined. And when government starts telling women that they're not real, they don't exist, and that everything that they are can be stolen by a dysphoric male who wants to dress up and play make-believe, when women's rights are being stolen to the extent that women can't even have their own bathrooms and showers and locker rooms any longer, for the Christian to remain silent in the face of that injustice, I think is an abomination. It's your obligation as a follower of Christ to, as Abraham Kuyper said, reclaim every inch of creation for Christ and his kingdom, every inch. In the arts, in the sciences, in the social venue of life, the cultural venues, the political venues, it is our obligation to engage and be salt to a culture that's rotting and light to a world that's walking in darkness. If we remain silent in the face of those things, shame on us. We did not do our job as the mouthpiece of Christ.
Yeah, I have two thoughts on that, and then we'll come to a close. The first is, I just finished reading recently Eric Metaxas's book, Letter to the American Church. I highly recommend it to you listeners. He tracks the parallels between what happened to the Lutheran Church pre-Nazism in the 20s and 30s and what's happening today. And it follows exactly what you're talking about. My second thought is that it's my view here that the politicization of every topic that emanates from secular leftism has infiltrated American Christianity, and we've allowed them to politicize things in a way that, wait a minute, it's like you said, who decides? Well, they have decided. They're saying abortion is political. If we accept that, we're accepting their premise about what is true, what should be discussed, and so on. And as soon as that happens, they won an enormous rhetorical battle in this cultural milieu we're in.
And I would just say, I know you want to cut this to a close, but I would say this: when Christians step away from the market square of ideas and say, well, we're not going to engage in those things that are political, we have ceded the territory of Christ's kingdom to the adversary by allowing the adversary, Satan, to define things as political and therefore off the radar for any discussion of Christianity and biblical ideals and biblical truth. And that is not the model that we are given by Christ. We are to reclaim every inch of his creation for him. And the definition of these words, whether they're political, whether they're social, whether they're biblical, whether they're moral, whether they're relative, whatever this is, if we cede the territory of defining words over to the enemy, we've lost. There's a reason that Jesus defined himself as the Word made flesh and dwelling among us, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the Lion of Judah, the Lamb of God. Jesus defines himself as an alphabet, if you will, Alpha and Omega, because he spells out the definition of life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. I am the Alpha and the Omega. I'm the alphabet. I spell things out. I am the Word with a capital W. I am truth with a capital T. This applies to every aspect of life and not just, quote unquote, the gospel. And I don't even accept that, because who decided that the gospel is just a discussion of salvation for eternity, as opposed to the reclamation of everything good in culture and the preservation of truth for our neighbor. I'm obligated to fight for truth and freedom for my neighbor. And if I ever shirk that responsibility, then I would argue I've compromised the gospel rather than stuck to it.
Everett, this has been a delight. And honestly, I could go on much longer. I'm already thinking perhaps I bring you back at a later time and we pursue some of these ideas, like, for instance, the kingdom of God. I think there's an enormous misunderstanding or even lack of understanding of what is the kingdom. You know, we pray the Lord's Prayer all the time, but when I've asked questions to people, what does it mean when Jesus says, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, as on earth as it is in heaven?" I get a lot of blank stares. And so maybe that's a topic we pick up at a later time. But this has been a delight. You are an inspiration. You're a shining light. I hope everybody sees this the way I did. I have just enjoyed this immensely. So thank you for joining the podcast.
Thanks, Guy. Honored as always.
As a certified professional leadership coach, I have the privilege of working with leaders of all ages and backgrounds, C-level executives, nonprofit leaders, small business owners, and self-employed professionals. I am passionately driven to help each of these men and women be better servant leaders every day. In this podcast, my goal has been to help you do the same. That's my calling. That's my mission. That's why I have guests on here like Everett. If my message today speaks to you, please subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast app, or you can find it on YouTube at youtube.com/ and then the @ symbol, Flourishing Leadership, youtube.com/ Flourishing Leadership. And please, let your friends and colleagues know about it. Check us out at flourishing-leadership.com, where you can learn more about my leadership coaching approach and methodology and how it can help you, and where you also can find all the podcast episodes. Because today, my friends, your leadership, flourishing leadership, has never been more needed.